In many empires, marriage was not primarily about personal choice, it was a political instrument. Families negotiated alliances, officials approved unions, property moved through carefully monitored channels. A woman's future could be determined by agreements made before she ever spoke for herself. The second method was control through inheritance. Ownership meant independence, independence meant options. Options created uncertainty for rulers who preferred predictable populations. By limiting property rights, many imperial systems ensured that wealth remained concentrated within approved structures. Women could contribute to economies, labor within households, and strengthen family fortunes, yet remain excluded from meaningful control over the resources they helped create. The third method was control through education. Knowledge creates questions. Questions create challenges. Challenges create change. For this reason, opportunities for learning were often restricted, not everywhere, not always. History contains remarkable exceptions, but across many imperial systems, access to education remained uneven because information itself represented power. As we uncover these forgotten systems together, channels like Dark Inquest History help keep attention focused on what history often leaves buried in the archives. The fourth method was control through legal identity. In many places, a woman's status existed within a framework defined by fathers, husbands, brothers, or institutions. Decisions regarding movement, property, contracts, and public participation frequently required approval from others. This wasn't always enforced through dramatic confrontations. More often, it appeared in paperwork, a missing signature, a denied request, a closed office door. The fifth method was control through social expectations. Not every empire relied on written laws. Some relied on something more powerful, normalization. Mal October 14 CE. You stand in a stone corridor lit by wavering oil lamps. The air is cool but not comforting. Somewhere beyond the walls, sandals scrape against polished floors. A door opens. A door closes. Names are spoken in low voices. Records are carried from one room to another. You wait without knowing what decision has already been made about your future. You hear the rustle of parchment. You hear the sound of a seal pressed into wax. You hear nothing else. No trial, no warning, no explanation. Only the growing realization that your life is no longer your own. The silence is not accidental. The silence is part of the process. And as the footsteps fade into darkness, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. Death would have been easier than what followed. What history records as custom, tradition, or law often conceals something far more calculated. Across centuries and across continents, empires discovered that controlling women was not merely a social preference. It was a method of governing entire populations. This was not random cruelty, this was policy, this was administration, this was power organized into procedures. From the courts of ancient kingdoms to the bureaucracies of vast imperial states, rulers understood a simple reality: control the lives of women, and you influence families. Influence families, and you shape society. Shape society, and you secure the empire. What they don't teach is how often these systems appeared ordinary. They arrived as documents, as taxes, as marriage contracts, as inheritance laws, as restrictions presented as protection. What wasn't written down was the fear that lived behind them. Empires rarely needed constant force, they preferred compliance. Compliance was cheaper, compliance lasted longer, compliance could be passed from one generation to the next. The first method was control through marriage. Empires did not merely shape the present, they shaped the stories people inherited. Achievements disappeared from records, contributions went uncredited, names faded from official histories, not erased by time but by design. What wasn't written down could be forgotten, and what could be forgotten could no longer challenge the narrative of power. The tenth method was perhaps the most effective of all, control through fear, not always fear of punishment, fear of isolation, fear of exclusion, fear of uncertainty, fear of becoming invisible. The most enduring systems rarely depended on constant enforcement. They depended on people understanding the consequences of crossing invisible lines, and those consequences often remained unspoken. To understand the human cost, we must move beyond institutions and return to individuals. Consider the life of Ban Jiao, a scholar, historian, and educator in imperial China. She achieved what many women of her era could not. Her writings survived, her name endured. Yet even her story reveals the boundaries surrounding women's lives. Success often required navigating expectations carefully, speaking within accepted frameworks while contributing extraordinary intellectual work. Or consider Christine de Pizan centuries later. Through writing, she challenged assumptions about women's abilities and value. Her words survived because she refused silence, but for every recorded voice, countless others vanished. No statues, no biographies, no surviving letters, only absence. A mother whose name never entered a government archive, a daughter whose contributions were attributed elsewhere, a widow whose property disappeared through legal procedures, a scholar whose work was never copied. History remembers empires. History often forgets the individuals who lived beneath them, and sometimes the silence says more than any surviving document. Imagine the waiting, the uncertainty, the knowledge that decisions affecting your life are being made elsewhere. You hear conversations behind closed doors. You hear judgments disguised as procedures. You hear officials describing policies. You never hear your own voice included among them. This wasn't one empire. It wasn't one century. It wasn't one ruler. The pattern appeared again and again. Different languages, different flags, different religions, different governments. The same underlying principle. Control presented as order, restriction presented as necessity, silence presented as normal. At the darkest turning points, these systems reveal their true nature, not through dramatic spectacles, not through chaos, but through efficiency, a sealed document, a denied inheritance, a prohibited education, a forced separation from opportunity, a future narrowed without explanation. A door closing quietly, a record amended, a name removed, a possibility extinguished. The most unsettling aspect was how ordinary it all appeared. Officials returned home. Records were filed away. The administrators moved to the next case. The machinery continued operating, and countless lives changed forever. What they don't teach is that bureaucracies can reshape human existence without raising their voices. A whisper can alter a destiny, a signature can redefine a future, a missing entry in an archive can erase generations from collective memory, and so the consequences spread far beyond individual lives. Political structures became more rigid, economic opportunities narrowed, cultural expectations hardened. Entire societies adapted themselves around limitations that had once been imposed from above. Some restrictions eventually weakened, others survived for centuries. Many transformed into new forms. The empire vanished, the habits remained, the rulers disappeared, the assumptions endured. This is the aftermath history often struggles to measure. People began accepting systems because those systems appear permanent. When restrictions become ordinary, resistance becomes difficult to imagine. This wasn't enforced through chains, it was enforced through repetition, through stories, through customs, through expectations repeated so often that alternatives seemed impossible. What history records are the rules. What history rarely records are the thousands of private moments when individuals questioned them in silence. The sixth method was control through public reputation. In many societies, honor became a form of surveillance. Communities watched one another. Families monitored behavior. Reputations determined opportunities. The result was a system requiring little direct intervention from rulers. People enforced expectations themselves. The empire simply benefited from the outcome. The seventh method was control to labor. Women contributed to agriculture, trade, manufacturing, household management, and countless forms of economic activity. Yet recognition often remained limited. Their work sustained communities, their labor strengthened economies, their efforts supported imperial prosperity, but official records frequently assigned credit elsewhere. This wasn't accidental. When contributions remain invisible, demands for recognition become easier to ignore. The eighth method was control through movement. The ability to travel creates possibilities. Possibilities create independence. Independence introduces uncertainty. Throughout history, numerous systems regulated where women could go, when they could travel, and under what conditions. Again, the mechanisms varied. Some relied on formal restrictions, others relied on social pressure. Both achieved similar results: a smaller world, a narrower horizon, a future defined by boundaries established by someone else. The ninth method was control through historical memory itself, not the rise of a dynasty, not the fall of a captive, but the invisible inheritance left behind, the expectations passed from parent to child, the opportunities never offered, the voices never heard, the stories never written. If we continue examining these forgotten histories together through Dark Inquest History, we continue a larger effort, recovering what was buried, questioning what was normalized, and remembering those who official records overlooked. Yet history is not entirely silent. Fragments survived, letters survived, diaries survived, poems survived, witnesses survived, memories survived. Against extraordinary odds, traces remained, enough to reveal patterns, enough to expose systems, enough to remind us that behind every imperial policy stood real people navigating lives constrained by forces larger than themselves. What history records are emperors, conquests, and borders. What wasn't written down were the countless moments of quiet endurance. The women who adapted, the women who resisted, the women who survived, the women whose names vanished even as their influence shaped generations. Their stories were not erased by time. They were often hidden by design, and perhaps that is the most unsettling lesson of all. The greatest power of an empire was never simply its armies or its wealth. It was its ability to make control appear natural, to make restrictions appear ordinary, to make silence appear inevitable. But silence is never empty. Silence carries memory. Silence carries absence. Silence carries the weight of those who are expected to disappear. And centuries later, their presence can still be felt in the spaces between the lines of history, buried in the archives, waiting in forgotten records, standing quietly behind every official narrative, still waiting to be heard. If remembering those women matters, then subscribe to Dark Inquest History, because preserving their stories is one small way to ensure they are not forgotten a second time.